Madam Chairman, today's discussion of the UN's relationship with the European Union and the role of this union in international efforts to ensure peace and security is taking place in a special setting. We can state that by the beginning of 2025, the degradation of the European Union from an economic project called for by the cooperation of former opponents and enemies to prevent a new war in Europe, politically applying all efforts to sow hostility on our continent and to provoke this hostility and war, is almost over. The once healthy integration club that promoted cooperation projects with Russia has today finally turned into a stubborn and aggressive Russophobic bloc that has put its energy, economic, social, and financial well-being at stake in a senseless confrontation with its eastern neighbor. Today, as never before, it is obvious that the European Union is rapidly losing this confrontation. Today, it is also quite obvious to call the key miscalculations of the EU Brussels, which have led to such a deplorable situation for the bloc. In particular, I would like to highlight the latest large-scale expansion of the EU since 2004, when some states became members of the bloc for political reasons, which were not fully conformed to the criteria of membership formulated by the EU itself. As a result, the EU, with its Russophobic cockroaches in its head, included Poles, Baltics, and some other young Europeans suffering from a complex of sharp historical revanchism. Over the course of more than 20 years, we can say with regret that these cockroaches have been breeding and settling in the heads of those who have not only not suffered from Russophobia over the past decades, but also advocated for the development of mutually beneficial cooperation with Russia. This process was gradual, but negative changes became more and more noticeable. Thus, in 2008, the policy of Eastern Partnership was formulated, aimed at breaking the mutually beneficial ties between Russia and its neighbors and their reorientation to the EU. Ukraine became its main victim, where the West began to consistently implement the anti-Russia project, forming and promoting hostility to all Russians, which was consistently presented as a threat to the future of this state. Its elite imposed unprofitable economic deals, which implied a complete breakup of the common economic space with Russia and any kind of goodwill with it at all. The epitome of these efforts was the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev 6 years later in 2014, and 3 EU countries, including France, Germany, and Poland, became direct directors and producers of it. It was they who did not keep the promises and guarantees given to the former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and did not insist on the implementation of the radical opposition of the prisoners with the help of the agreements. Well, what happened next is well known. The nationalists who came to power launched a real war to destroy the peaceful Russian-speaking residents of Donbass, thus provoking an armed conflict within Ukraine. It could have been stopped with the help of the Minsk agreements and the imprisonment of 2 EU members, Germany and France. However, as we already know well from the confession of former leaders of these states, the Kiev regime was not going to implement them, and Berlin and Paris, instead of forcing it to do so, used the Minsk process exclusively as a smokescreen in order to arm Ukraine and prepare it for the war with Russia. And since the slaughter of the Russian-speaking population, which killed more than 10,000 people, did not stop, but intensified significantly by February 2022, we had to start a special military operation. After that, the EU, on the Russian-speaking soil, what is called, completely tore the roof off. It abandoned the cheap Russian energy sources, according to the principle of evil eyes and ears from the outside, without hesitation swallowing the explosion of the North Stream, and plunged its economy into a deep crisis, imposing sanctions on Russia, from which it suffered in the end. It began to try to prohibit Russian culture, reaching absurdity, for example, by renaming Russian artists to Ukrainian, and threw all his strength to finance the war in Ukraine, in the desperate hope that Zelensky's regime would be able to inflict military defeat on Russia. And when the new U.S. president announced a new Washington course to achieve a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, the European Union became an appellate agent of war, having finally completed its mission. And today, it is applying all its strength to prevent the American-Russian dialogue in Ukraine. To illustrate this, it is enough to recall the recent statements of the Prime Minister of Denmark, I quote, "Peace in Ukraine is more dangerous than a continuing war." The comments are, as they say, superfluous. Mr. President, some countries today are crumbling because we are not engaging in a dialogue with Europe. Russia has not had a dialogue with the European Union for a long time, not because we interrupted this dialogue, but because it was done by the EU countries, and there are almost no interlocutors in Europe for us. Today's meeting is a great illustration of this, because the new High Representative of the EU on Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the frank Russophobe Kaja Kallas, spoke at this meeting. She is well known in our country. We remember her words, which were said in the presence of the Prime Minister of Estonia that, I quote, "Defeat of Russia is not so bad, and that it is not so bad if a large power becomes smaller." End of quote. Already at my new post, I fantasize about the entry of the strongest army of Europe into NATO, which it considers to be the armed forces of Ukraine. She had the audacity to claim that, I quote, "Russian citizens do not die in a conflict," while demonstrating the banner of the Marine Infantry Brigade of the USSR, responsible for numerous crimes and murders of civilians in the Kursk region. How can such blasphemous claims be treated in my country, if only last year the number of civilians killed by the USSR on the territory of Russia was almost 5,500 people, 809 of them were killed. 347 children were killed, 51 children were killed. And at the beginning of this year, after the liberation of the settlement of Russkaya Porochnaya in the Kursk region, in the basements of residential buildings, torture chambers were found and arranged. They found the saws of the families of civilians, mostly elderly people, tortured to death by the Ukrainian Nazis. This is not some kind of staged riot, which was created by the Kiev authorities, where the Kiev prince takes Western guests on excursions. This is a real crime. We have repeatedly drawn attention to such cases in the SBU and on other international platforms. Just a few days ago, several more victims were found in the same village. Surely, in the coming days, this list of grievances will be significantly increased. After all, today the Ukrainian army, with huge losses, like a scourge, is fleeing the Kursk region, and the area of the liberated territory is measured in tens of square kilometers. Only today was the largest-scale attack of Ukrainian drones on the territory of Russia, including Moscow and Moscow Oblast. 337 drones were shot down, 91 of them over Moscow. People died and were injured. This, surprisingly, coincided with the visit to Moscow of the General Secretary of the OSCE, Fyodor Sinirlioglu. Apparently, the Kiev regime decided to demonstrate its true terrorist nature. Ukrainian drones were aimed at civilian facilities. We have repeatedly emphasized that the Russian armed forces strike on military or related to Ukrainian military-industrial complex targets. We do not fire on residential areas or social institutions, unlike Ukrainian premeditated attacks on civilian facilities in Russia. Colleagues, how do you imagine our conversation with such characters who have been hating Russia for many years in a row? Even before her appointment to her high European post, Ms. Kallas took the most direct part in the years-long campaigns in her country aimed at pushing the Russian language out of Estonia, which is still a native language for a significant part of its population. As a result, about 5% of the population in the country are not citizens. However, it seems that this status will soon be abolished. Virtually all opportunities for obtaining education in the Russian language. There is an active struggle against xenophobia in the Estonian Orthodox Church. On the streets, Nazis openly walk around, and monuments are erected to Hitler's accomplices. In short, when visiting Ukraine or communicating with representatives of Zelensky's regime, Ms. Kallas essentially falls into an ideologically friendly environment. Of course, she is not confused by the violation of the rights of the Russian-speaking population, tens of thousands of political prisoners, the lack of political freedom, and the harshest censorship and persecution of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. She is not confused because she sees all this at home in Estonia. Therefore, she sincerely believes that violating the rights of the Russians and killing them, not killing them, is normal. As you can see, even a hypothetical dialogue between Russia and the European Union, the face of which becomes a politician with such convictions. The European Union, in which it is easy to remove its leader from the pre-election race, without presenting him with any small convincing accusations, as it happened in Romania. Colleagues, in conclusion, taking into account everything I have said, I would like to urge you to seriously consider whether the EU needs a dialogue with such a structure, which, roughly violating the human rights itself, is strongly associated all over the world with the aggressive imposition of neoliberal approaches and human rights moral doctrines, combining them with neo-colonial practices, raising manual dictatorial regimes, and strict sanctions against those who disagree. Such an approach has nothing and cannot have anything in common with the efforts of the UN and the principle of its cooperation with regional organizations, in accordance with Chapter 8 of the Charter. It is not surprising that the countries of the Global South, instead of adopting European rules, more and more often make a choice in favor of equal and non-violent associations, such as BRICS and SHOS. As for Russia, we are ready for a mutually respectful dialogue with those European countries that do not focus on the establishment of various chaoses and forms of derailment, and put their national priorities and tasks of establishing a stable and long-term peace based on respect for the positions and interests of all states, including Russia. And the more in Europe states that do not share the same Russophobic beliefs of Ms. Kallas and others, the greater the chances of peaceful and progressive development